Under the sharp, cloudless sky of southern New Mexico, where the dry wind carried the scent of mesquite and distant dust storms whispered against the horizon, Nick Stewart stood at the edge of his land, boots buried in the cracked ochre soil. His ranch was not large by commercial standards, but it was his, every inch of it earned through decades of disciplined labor, sacrifice, and stubborn resolve. Set across rolling fields, low desert vegetation, and one gravel road that curved like a scar through the hills, the property had once belonged to his father, a man of few words and unshakable principles. Nick had grown up here, mended fences here, buried horses and planted trees here. He had left once, long ago, chasing city money and the illusion of something shinier, but he had returned, wiser, hardened, and uninterested in noise or novelty. He didn't retreat from life. He simply carved out a corner of it that obeyed his rules. That morning, like most others, had begun with the rhythm of routine, checking water troughs, tending to the stallion that had developed a limp the week before, inspecting the old windmill pump that had coughed and stuttered during the night. And then, something subtle, so small it almost escaped him, had caught his eye. At first, he thought the marks were nothing. Tire impressions pressed lightly into the dirt, arcing across the far pasture in a lazy semicircle. A vehicle of some kind, but not heavy enough to be a truck. He squatted down, pressing 2 fingers into the print and brushing the dirt aside with a trained hand. The grooves were too shallow for anything industrial. Narrow, consistent spacing. Golf cart, maybe. His brows furrowed. There was no reason for a golf cart to be there. That particular stretch of land wasn't near the county road and wasn't visible from the public trail. It was behind the main barn near the horses' rotational paddock. Private. Unmistakably private. Nick didn't jump to conclusions. Over the years he'd learned the cost of assuming too quickly. But the next day, the tracks were back. Only now deeper, fresher, zigzagging across one of the native grass plots he'd been carefully restoring. Not just cutting through, looping, as if someone had taken a joyride through the fragile soil. His patience thinned. He didn't have surveillance cameras covering that section. There had never been a need. No one came out here. His closest neighbor on that side had sold their place 6 months prior, and the property had sat empty until recently. He'd heard rumors about the new buyer, a woman, late 50s maybe, with a taste for spa music and outdoor aromatherapy. Karen Summers. Ran something called a wellness micro-resort on the edge of town a few years back before zoning issues shut it down. Supposedly, she had purchased the nearby parcel to reconnect with earth energies and planned to hold private outdoor yoga events, nature walks, and grounding retreats. Nick didn't care. People could believe in whatever they wanted as long as they kept their wheels and their noise off his grass. But as the third set of tracks appeared, this time cutting closer to the fenced paddock where he kept his yearlings, Nick made the decision to walk over. The property boundary between his land and hers wasn't marked with anything fancy. A simple barbed wire fence ran along most of it, and where it faded into natural formations, boulders marked the division. Nick walked the edge until he reached a shallow break in the slope where an old cattle trail dipped. There it was. A fresh indentation in the brush. Tire marks leading directly into her property. No gates, no signs. Just a worn dirt path that connected her land to his as if the division didn't matter. And at the other end, about 50 yards away, sat a golf cart. Electric, shiny, lime green. Parked casually beside a patch of lavender bushes, with a folded blanket draped over the roof. No mistaking it now. He called out before stepping any farther, keeping his tone even. After a moment, she appeared from behind a screen of willows, tall, wiry, with silver hair twisted into a loose knot and wearing a white linen tunic that looked like it belonged in a retreat catalog. She smiled like he was an old friend and waved. "Hi there. Sorry, didn't mean to spook the animals. I was just trying to get across before the sun really came up. It's brutal this week, huh?" Nick didn't return the smile. "You're crossing my land." She tilted her head. "Oh, I didn't realize you used that section. It just seemed like the natural route. It's much shorter than going around the road, and that trail was already there." "That trail was a cattle path before I fenced it. That's not public land." Her smile faltered for half a beat. "I see. Well, it's not like I'm doing damage. I'm just passing through, and I'm being mindful. I stay on the same track each time." Nick's tone hardened. "You've cut across 3 times. The soil's loose out there. I've been reseeding. That's my time and money you're running over." She exhaled gently, like someone trying to de-escalate a fussy child. "Okay, I hear you. I'll go around next time. I really didn't mean anything by it." Nick gave a small nod, turned without a word, and walked back to his fence line. He didn't want an argument. He didn't want escalation. What he wanted was respect. Not of himself, but of his land. And he had made himself clear. For 3 days, the ground was untouched. Then, on the 4th morning, the tire tracks returned, this time farther in, crisscrossing through the paddock access route. Nick's throat tightened as he stared at them. Not out of rage, he didn't operate on impulse, but from the clarity that this was no longer about ignorance. She had chosen to continue. The next 48 hours were a flurry of measured responses. He visited the county clerk's office to ensure every inch of his land was formally and currently registered. He documented the damage with photographs and topographic grid markings. He drafted a letter and delivered it personally. No threats, no accusations, just a formal notice of trespass. The reply came the next morning. A hand-drawn sign appeared near the trailhead on her side. "Shortcut path to studio. Approved by local ranch owner." Beneath it, a simple heart symbol. Nick stared at it, lips parting in disbelief. She had made it seem as though he had sanctioned the route, as if they were partners in some backwoods resort partnership. Later that day, Nick received a voicemail from a woman named Dana who said she'd seen photos of the beautiful open horse fields and wanted to book a short sunrise walk through the grounds. When he called her back to inform her that she had the wrong idea, she seemed surprised. "But Karen said the trail goes right through. She said you agreed it would be better for the community." It wasn't the violation itself that wore on him. It was the casualness. The presumption that land meant less than someone's sense of convenience. That private property could be reinterpreted as shared space just because someone was too lazy or too entitled to drive the long way around. Nick had lived through droughts, lost livestock to lightning strikes, pulled calves from dead mares, buried dogs, watched fences burn. He wasn't fragile. But there was something about being smiled at while someone stole from you that brought a special kind of fury. It was not explosive or loud. It was cold, still, like steel being tempered in flame. That night, Nick didn't sleep much. He sat on his porch with a notebook, pen moving in measured strokes under the porch light. He wasn't writing a plan for revenge. He was writing a ledger of what had been crossed, what had been said, what had been ignored. A list of quiet steps to restore the line that had been erased without permission. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was preparing for it. On the morning following his sleepless night, Nick awoke with a sense of heavy inevitability pressing down on him. The kind of weight that doesn't come from a single event, but from the understanding that something has shifted in the landscape around you. Not physically, but in its meaning. The land he had always known as his own, solid, unquestionable, patient, had been recast into something disputed, something undermined. As he drank his coffee, the early light stretched across the ridges, painting his fields in gold. Normally, he found this sight grounding, but today it seemed indifferent, as if the land itself had grown tired of being defended. He walked out to the paddock before sunrise, more out of habit than intention, and there again were the tracks. They cut deep this time, carving a full circle near the water troughs before turning back toward the slope. He examined the marks and noted where the wheels had skidded. It hadn't just been a drive-through. Someone had loitered. By late morning, Nick was back inside, printing off high-resolution images from his trail camera. Though it had been set primarily to monitor wildlife near the irrigation line, it had, inadvertently, captured several frames of Karen's bright green golf cart, complete with a tasseled umbrella and a cooler strapped to the back. The timestamps were clear. Her cart had crossed onto his land 5 times in 8 days. One of the frames even showed a second passenger, a woman in activewear, mid-laugh, holding a phone high in the air as if documenting their adventure. Nick felt the familiar pinch at his temple. It wasn't anger in the cinematic sense, not rage or dramatic fury. It was the slow, cold burn of insult that settles in when someone isn't just violating your boundary, but mocking the fact that you have one at all. Nick drove into town and sat down with a local property attorney named Harris, a man he'd known for years and who respected straight talk. They spent an hour going over easement law, land use definitions, and civil response options. Harris examined the photos and reviewed Nick's official land survey, nodding slowly. She's not just trespassing. If she's directing other people through your land, using it as a draw for her business, that's commercial misrepresentation. That gives us leverage. Harris suggested drafting a formal cease and desist letter with notarized documentation attached, which Nick agreed to without hesitation. He also advised making a visit to the sheriff's office, not to press charges yet, but to log the incidents as a pattern in case the situation escalated. Nick followed through on every step. He was deliberate, calm, professional. He wasn't a man who believed in throwing punches before paperwork. The sheriff's deputy, a younger guy named McLennan, listened attentively, took notes, and promised to file the report under civil property dispute with repetitive encroachment. Nick didn't expect miracles. He just wanted the record in place. When he returned home, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the western ridge. He drove along the fence line and paused near the slope that bordered Karen's property. The sign she'd placed, the one claiming a shortcut had been approved by the local ranch owner, had now been laminated and mounted on a metal stake. Someone had taken the time to make it permanent. That evening, he parked the truck, poured himself a drink, and sat with Harris's letter in hand. He had it printed on thick paper, sealed in a stiff envelope. Tomorrow he would deliver it. He would put it in her hands, speak his piece, and walk away. And that would be the end of it. Or so he hoped. The following afternoon, Nick approached her property on foot. The air was hot, thick with dust and floral scent from a dozen strategically placed potted plants around Karen's yard. A path of flat stones led from her gate to a gazebo she had erected in the center of what was once an open meadow. Wind chimes clinked softly, strung from every corner. It looked more like a curated exhibit than a residence. Karen was reclining on a bamboo lounge chair beneath a shade sail, her feet up, face buried in a book. When she noticed him, she sat up quickly, brushing her hair back and rising with exaggerated grace. "Well, this is a surprise," she said, feigning cheerfulness. "Did you come to apologize?" Nick stared at her for a second, jaw tight, then held out the envelope. "This is a cease and desist letter. It's from my attorney. You've been trespassing on my land and falsely claiming my permission. If you continue to do so, we'll pursue legal remedies." Her face twitched, the smile retreating half an inch. She took the envelope, but didn't open it. "I don't understand this hostility, Nick. This community's always been about sharing. My guests are respectful. No one's hurting anything. You've posted false information. You've let people believe they're allowed on my land. That's damage." She folded her arms. "I think you're overreacting. I mean, it's just grass and some hills. You don't own the sky, for God's sake." Nick didn't respond. He didn't need to. He turned, walked back to the fence, and didn't look over his shoulder. 2 days later, a visitor arrived on Nick's property uninvited. Not Karen this time, but a young woman named Cassie who introduced herself as a creative consultant, working with Karen on a local wellness series. She was filming promotional material, she said, and wanted to capture some authentic ranch visuals. Nick told her, politely but firmly, that his property was not part of any such promotion and asked her to leave. She did, but not before he caught her glancing toward the horse paddock with her phone subtly angled upward, as if recording. That night, Nick reviewed the footage on his motion cameras. The woman had walked a full 20 feet past the fence line before he found her. Another log for the file. Another intrusion added to the growing list. The next day, Nick called Harris and authorized him to initiate a formal complaint. Harris, in turn, submitted a land use violation report to the county, attaching all documentation. They didn't accuse Karen directly of running a commercial operation without proper zoning. Not yet. But they raised enough red flags to trigger a routine review of her use permits. It was a slow lever to pull, but once engaged, it would be difficult to stop. Karen, unaware of this development, continued her charade. 3 mornings later, Nick found trash. Small, subtle, but unmistakably foreign. A smoothie cup with a logo from a trendy downtown juice bar sat crushed near the paddock gate. A bracelet of woven hemp, clearly dropped by accident, was tangled in the grass. Worse still, a new track pattern showed that someone had driven much closer to the barn than ever before. There were faint tire scrapes beneath the window near his tack room. This was no longer a nuisance. It was encroachment. And it was escalating. Nick contacted his insurance company. He didn't file a claim, but he logged a risk report, stating clearly that non-invited parties had entered the property in vehicles, had approached livestock, and had possibly accessed secured buildings. He detailed the potential liability risks and asked that the policy note these incidents for future reference. The insurer responded positively. Impressed with his documentation, they sent an adjuster out within 48 hours to photograph the site and confirm the details. If anything were to happen now, Nick would be covered. Later that week, a man showed up at his front gate. He was dressed too neatly for ranch work, with polished boots and a button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to just the right length. He introduced himself as Taylor, a land utilization strategist, working on behalf of a small group of investors seeking rural development opportunities. His tone was soft, measured, rehearsed. We're identifying properties that would benefit from collaborative zoning, Nick. Land that's been underutilized, with potential for ecotourism expansion. I think your corner of the desert has real value, and you're sitting right at the nexus of a new green corridor we're planning. Nick didn't laugh, though he wanted to. Who sent you? No one sent me, Taylor said, smiling. We've just noticed some interesting synergy between your land and the neighboring properties. If you were open to discussing lease options or even partial access agreements. Nick raised a hand. You can leave. Taylor opened his mouth to say something else, but thought better of it. He nodded, adjusted his cuffs, and walked back to his SUV without another word. As he drove off, Nick watched the vehicle's dust trail disappear into the road, his expression unreadable. What struck Nick most wasn't the audacity. It was the organization. These weren't accidents. This wasn't just a woman with a cart and too much nerve. This was a pattern, a widening ring of the pressure disguised as civility. Karen had begun with a shortcut. Now others had appeared, asking for access, offering deals, claiming misunderstandings. Nick wasn't naive. He'd seen these kinds of plays before. Polite smiles, softened words, and beneath it all, the quiet theft of rights. He didn't plan revenge. He didn't fume or rant. Instead, that night, Nick sat down at his kitchen table with a sketch pad and began to draw. Not traps, not weapons, layouts, routes, measurements, and in the margins, one quiet note. If they won't see the line, show them where it explodes. By the time the 3rd week had rolled around, Nick's tolerance, already worn thin, had dissolved entirely into a steady, quiet calculation. He had learned early in life that direct confrontation is rarely as effective as building a wall high enough that the opponent has to retreat out of principle, not fear. And yet, in this situation, the walls were figurative. the boundaries trampled under the wheels of mockery dressed as modern wellness. The cease and desist letter had been ignored. The trash had continued to appear, more frequently now and less subtly. Empty aluminum cans, fragments of incense sticks, a yoga mat partially rolled and left near the fence line. All of it signs that Karen or her entourage, whoever they were not just cutting through his land but treating it as an extension of their own space. Worse still, one of his mares had spooked 3 days ago, tearing her flank on a length of broken fencing wire he hadn't noticed had been bent and displaced. He'd repaired the fencing and treated the wound, but the damage was done. A purebred animal, now scarred and potentially compromised for future breeding. It was no longer about nuisance or pride. This had become tangible loss. Nick made no theatrical gestures. He didn't pound fists or shout across fences. Instead, he began to plan with the kind of deliberate resolve that men in his position were known for. Steady, methodical, and without the desire for applause. His first step was information. He reached out to an old acquaintance who had spent 15 years in agricultural zoning and land dispute mediation. They hadn't spoken in a while, but the man was direct and helpful. You're not going to win this by playing it as a landowner versus neighbor. You need to demonstrate commercial encroachment and liability exposure. Show that your property is becoming a legal risk because of her, and the county will act. Until then, you're just another grumpy rancher yelling about fences. So Nick followed the advice. He compiled a new file, meticulously organized. Photos of every track, time-stamped. Satellite overlays showing the paths of intrusion. Records of phone calls, names, and business cards. He even submitted a preliminary report to the State Department of Agriculture regarding unauthorized soil disruption and potential cross-contamination of forage zones. He wasn't sure that last piece would stick, but it added another layer of pressure. Bureaucracy moved slowly, but it moved, and when it did, it was hard to stop. Meanwhile, he began reinforcing his property in more practical ways. The first physical deterrent came in the form of post-mounted spikes. Not dangerous, but enough to jolt any small vehicle that tried to cruise over certain points. Then came the visual signage. New, professionally printed warnings clearly marking the property as off-limits, noting surveillance and recording. Cameras were upgraded, including one mobile unit designed to track motion and send alerts directly to his phone. He even installed a gate arm on the lesser-used western access route, just in case someone tried a flanking maneuver. All of it legal, all of it documented, and all of it done with the precision of a man who knew how fast excuses could erase boundaries. But Karen was nothing if not persistent. 2 days after the gate arm went up, she appeared at Nick's main fence line, waiting until she caught sight of him exiting the barn. She waved as if they were old friends, not opponents in a slow legal siege, and called out across the distance with a chirp in her voice. "Nick, we need to talk. I've had some guests complain that they feel a little pushed out. That's not very community-minded of you." Nick stood still for a moment, hands on his hips, then walked closer until he was within conversational range. "That's because your guests don't belong here, Karen. This isn't a trailhead. This isn't a park. It's a ranch. It's my ranch." She sighed with exaggerated patience. "Look, I get that you're attached to it. Really, I do. But this space has potential. You could do something meaningful here. Partner with the community. I mean, think bigger than fences. I don't want bigger. I want quiet. I want my animals safe. I want my land respected." Karen took a step forward, her expression tightening ever so slightly. "I'm offering you a chance to be part of something restorative, Nick. You're the only one standing in the way." His reply was flat. "And you're trespassing. Again." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing at the fence. That afternoon, he filed a formal complaint with the State Agriculture Enforcement Office for repeated unauthorized entry. The paper trail was thickening. But so were the provocations. The following morning, Nick found 3 small wooden stakes driven into the soil near the southern pasture line. They bore ribbons, blue, orange, and pink, the kind typically used in construction or landscape planning. They hadn't been there the day before. That night, he moved quietly with a headlamp and removed them. He didn't take them far, just far enough to let her know he'd seen them, understood the message, and rejected it. When they reappeared the next day, he called Harris. "We're past subtle," he said. "Make the call to the Code Enforcement Board, all of it. Soil damage, animal distress, misrepresentation. I want them on record. No more leniency." Harris didn't hesitate. A full complaint was lodged, complete with affidavits, photographic records, and supporting documentation. This wasn't just noise now. It was official, procedural, and backed by multiple points of data. Nick's hands stayed clean. His tools were words, documents, and the weight of accumulated evidence. But Karen escalated in turn. She filed a harassment complaint with the sheriff's department, claiming Nick was stalking her property at night, shining lights toward her home, and intimidating her guests. It was baseless, of course, but it forced a deputy to come out and check in. The officer, a man Nick recognized from the town's 4-H events, was apologetic but professional. "You've got nothing to worry about, Mr. Stewart, but these kinds of reports create noise, paperwork, and when they stack up, even the truth starts to get muddy." Nick nodded, understanding all too well. It was about control, not resolution, about exhausting him through process, wearing down his resolve until he either sold out or compromised. But he wasn't built for retreat. He had survived worse storms than this, buried deeper heartbreaks in the same soil she now drove across with her ridiculous little vehicle. That weekend, Nick drove into the nearest town with a supplier that dealt in agricultural deterrence, mostly things for pest control and wildlife management. Among the options was a set of non-lethal perimeter charges designed to scare off predators. Originally intended for coyotes and feral hogs, these flash charges released a loud bang and a bright flash of light when triggered, startling animals and warning humans alike that they had stepped where they shouldn't. Legal in New Mexico, used across dozens of rural properties. He bought 6. Back at the ranch, he chose a spot carefully, the area where the tire tracks most frequently crossed. He buried the charges lightly beneath the topsoil, linking them to a weighted tripwire system disguised among the rocks and brush. Not deadly, not dangerous, but startling enough to deliver a message, and the message would be loud. He tested the system once, at dusk, using a weighted plank. The explosion of light and sound echoed through the pasture, sending a flock of nearby birds skyward. Effective. The tripwire reset easily. Discreet. Satisfying. The next day passed quietly. So did the one after. Nick tended his animals, cleaned the tack shed, mended a broken pipe. But on the third day, in the late afternoon, his phone buzzed with an alert. Motion triggered near the pasture. He checked the camera feed and saw it. The green golf cart approaching at its usual angle, weaving past the warning signs with arrogant confidence. Karen was alone this time, wearing sunglasses and a scarf as if trying to disguise her presence, as if that changed anything. She hit the tripwire at 7 miles per hour. The charge detonated perfectly. Light burst upward in a flare, the sound cracking through the air like thunder. The golf cart jolted, veered sideways, then crashed through a small wire barrier and skidded into a shallow trench. Karen screamed, not from pain, but sheer panic, and flailed as the vehicle came to a lurching stop. She stumbled out, tripping over the uneven ground, then stood there in the dust, waving her arms and shouting something unintelligible across the pasture. Nick stood calmly at the edge of the paddock, arms crossed, watching her with the expression of someone who had already predicted every detail. He didn't approach. He didn't yell. He simply watched until she staggered back into her cart and reversed, the vehicle limping and lopsided as she drove away. That night, he wrote one sentence in his ledger, just beneath the last entry. She finally listened. Karen didn't come back the next day, nor the one after. For a brief moment, Nick allowed himself the luxury of thinking that maybe, just maybe, the message had finally landed. The perimeter remained untouched, the motion sensors didn't trigger, and for 48 uninterrupted hours the land exhaled. The horses settled. The sky seemed a little wider. But Nick had lived long enough to know that silence, particularly from people like Karen, was rarely surrender. It was recalibration. And sure enough, the quiet was broken not by the return of her cart, but by something subtler and somehow more insidious. On a gray Tuesday morning, Nick received a certified letter in the mail. The envelope bore the insignia of a legal firm out of Albuquerque. Inside was a formal notice, dense with language designed to intimidate and mislead. Karen Summers was alleging that Nick Stewart had created an unsafe and hostile environment, had utilized hazardous materials in an unregulated manner, and had willfully endangered a civilian visitor without warning or signage. The document cited a variety of vague statutes and ordinances, none of them particularly relevant, but each word crafted to cast Nick in the light of a threat. There was even an attached photo, a zoomed-in image of the scorched patch of earth where the flash charge had detonated, framed in such a way that it appeared violent, chaotic, like a battlefield instead of the controlled deterrent it had been. Nick didn't flinch. He packed the document into a file and drove it to Harris's office that same afternoon. The attorney skimmed it, eyes narrowing slightly, then leaned back in his chair and gave a low whistle. "She's not trying to win a case," Harris said. "She's trying to flip the narrative, paint you as unstable, someone who poses a threat to community safety. It's textbook misdirection." He looked up. "But she's got no case. These aren't criminal charges, Nick. This is a bluff." Nick nodded slowly. "So, how do we respond?" "We don't," Harris said. "Not directly. I'll file a formal rebuttal with documentation of the legal purchase and use of the flash deterrence. I'll attach copies of every warning you posted. I'll also request that her attorneys disclose the full scope of her activities on your land, including promotional materials. If she refuses or fails to provide them, we'll cite it as obstruction and move to dismiss the claim. That'll put her on her heels." While Harris handled the legal front, Nick turned his attention to the root of the issue: Karen's use of his land to promote her so-called wellness events. He'd been aware of the social media posts, the vague mentions in community newsletters, but now he began to dig deeper. Not by becoming some amateur sleuth, but by leveraging what he already knew. People talk. At the co-op feed store, he struck up a casual conversation with the young woman who ran the register. She mentioned offhand that a few of her friends had signed up for a desert retreat run by a woman named Karen, that it included sunrise meditation walks through open land with horses nearby. Another man, older, leaning on the counter with a weathered hat and calloused hands, added that he'd heard a neighbor say something similar. "Pretty lady runs some kind of spiritual camp up near the ridge." That was all Nick needed. Not confirmation, just context. Karen wasn't just crossing his land for convenience, she was selling it as part of her image, using it as set dressing for her curated fantasy of peace and authenticity. His ranch was a backdrop to her brand, and she hadn't paid a cent for the privilege. Later that week, Nick returned to the county recorder's office and requested copies of any permits or business filings under her name. The clerk, efficient and polite, confirmed that while Karen did have a registered sole proprietorship for Summers Solace, there were no land use permits attached to the property she owned, and certainly none that authorized commercial activity. Across a neighbor's acreage, the clerk raised an eyebrow as she handed over the file. "If she's been charging for access, she's in violation. This isn't a gray area." Nick thanked her, made copies, and returned home. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with the paperwork spread before him like a map of her arrogance. He wasn't surprised. Not anymore. But there was something deeply clarifying about seeing it in writing. The way she'd tried to slip beneath regulations, ride the edges of legality, and rely on charm and feigned ignorance to carry her through. But the paper didn't lie, and the paper was now on his side. The following morning, Harris filed a counter-complaint with the County Development Board, including the information from the recorder's office, the unpermitted use and the social media promotion of events that featured land outside her ownership. A week later, Karen received a formal notice from the board, requesting a full accounting of her operations and scheduling an inspection to verify compliance. Nick heard about it secondhand through the same local channels she had used to inflate her reputation. Apparently, Karen had been stressed and blindsided, complaining loudly that someone was trying to destroy her vision. It was not the explosion of justice some might fantasize about, but it was better. It was slow erosion, the kind that collapsed cliffs not with thunder, but with time. And it was working. But the most unexpected turn came not through lawyers or letters, but through a knock at Nick's front door. It was late evening, and the knock was tentative, like someone unsure whether they should even be there. When he opened the door, a woman stood on the porch. Mid-30s, short blonde hair, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes alert but not unfriendly. She introduced herself as Marina, one of Karen's part-time assistants. She'd worked on a few events, helped organize the retreat schedule, managed guest lists, that sort of thing. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said quickly. "I just thought you should know something. And I didn't want to send an email because, well, you'd probably ignore it. I would." Nick didn't invite her in, but he didn't send her away. They stood on the porch, cool air settling between them. "She lied to us," Marina said plainly. "She told us she had access. She said you were a friend, that this was all agreed upon. But after the flash thing, she kind of unraveled, started talking about how you were trying to ruin her. She gave us instructions on what to say if anyone asked, to act like the path was public or like we'd just gotten confused. But it didn't sit right with me. You never gave permission, did you?" Nick shook his head slowly. "No, I didn't." Marina nodded, almost relieved. "Then I'm done helping her, and if anyone asks, I'll say exactly that. I just wanted you to know." Nick thanked her, and she left. No theatrics, no dramatic revelations, just quiet integrity from someone who'd seen enough. The next day, Harris added Marina's statement to the growing dossier. The case was no longer about a woman with a golf cart and poor judgment. It was about willful misuse of land, fraudulent representation, and the manipulation of a narrative to silence the rightful owner. The balance had shifted, and for the first time since this began, Nick felt not just in control, but vindicated. Not in a way that needed an audience, in a way that was steady, internal, undeniable. He walked the boundary line that evening, long shadows stretching behind him. The flash charge site was quiet. Its scorch mark faded into the dust. The air was dry, the sky turning violet. And across the way at Karen's the lights were off. No music, no guests, just silence, for now. The silence didn't last. Just as Nick had begun to believe that the tide was turning for good, that perhaps Karen had recognized the line she had crossed and backed down permanently, the second escalation began. Not with a roar, but with the same kind of slow, deliberate intrusion that had marked her first offenses. This time, though, the veneer of charm had been stripped away. What replaced it was a cold, calculated persistence. The flash charge incident, the legal pushback, the exposure of her unauthorized operations, and Marina's quiet defection from her camp should have ended the campaign. But instead of retreating, Karen adapted. She moved out of the open and into the shadows, less visible, more careful, and far more cunning. It started with the complaints. Within 2 weeks of Harris filing the zoning violation documentation, Nick received a formal notice from the local environmental health department. The complaint alleged that Nick's land was being improperly used for storage of hazardous materials, specifically citing the flash deterrents. While Nick had used them legally and documented every aspect of their installation and testing, The complaint forced an investigation. An inspector arrived unannounced one morning, clipboard in hand, and asked to tour the site. Nick cooperated fully. He walked the inspector through every relevant area, provided receipts, product manuals, and photos of their lawful use. The inspector, clearly unenthused by the complaint, checked each item, asked a few procedural questions, and ultimately confirmed that no violations had occurred. Before leaving, he muttered that these kinds of calls were becoming more frequent, petty neighbors weaponizing departments to settle private scores. Nick didn't respond, but the insight wasn't lost on him. Shortly after the inspection, he received another letter. This one was from the County Animal Welfare Office, alerting him that a complaint had been made suggesting neglect of livestock. It was absurd on its face. Nick's animals were regularly vetted, well-fed, well-kept, and visibly healthy. But it didn't matter. Another inspection was scheduled, another disruption, another record added to the bureaucratic noise surrounding his name. Karen wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to exhaust him. Then came the social campaign. Posts began to appear online, short, vague, but targeted. A local wellness influencer made a cryptic video about a neighbor's escalating behavior, using generic descriptions that clearly pointed toward Nick's ranch. Comments beneath the video spiraled into speculation. Karen herself didn't post anything direct, but she liked and shared the content, letting others do the dirty work of character assassination. She was seeding doubt, spinning a narrative in which Nick was the aggressor, the unstable loner guarding unused land with explosives and paranoia. She used buzzwords: eco-hostile, territorial aggression, rural resistance to community healing. It was a psychological warfare dressed in digital lace. Nick refused to take the bait. He didn't respond online. He didn't make a statement. Instead, he compiled every post, every comment, every share, and passed them to Harris, who began drafting a digital harassment brief. One step at a time, piece by piece, Nick built his fortress out of truth and process. But even as he moved through the legal avenues with methodical patience, the emotional toll was growing. His ranch, once a place of absolute solitude and sanctuary, now buzzed with tension. Even the animals seemed to feel it. The mares were more jumpy than usual. The stallion had stopped resting in his usual spot near the outer fence, and Nick himself found sleep harder to come by. Then, just when he thought she had run out of tactics, Karen escalated in a way that shifted the conflict from digital warfare to something more visceral and dangerous. It was just after midnight when the alarms went off. Nick had installed the perimeter motion sensors months ago, tied to a low-frequency alert that vibrated a receiver near his bed without creating noise. When it buzzed this time, he sat up immediately, heart already hammering in his chest, instinct carrying him to his feet before his mind fully caught up. He grabbed the flashlight and his jacket, slipped on his boots, and made his way out the back door, cutting the light as he moved to the edge of the porch. The alert had come from the northern fence line, the least trafficked side of the property, bordered by a line of cottonwoods and a shallow ravine. As he approached, he stayed low, moving along the tree line until he had a view of the field. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a flicker of movement. A silhouette crouched near the fence, flashlight low, fumbling with something near the ground. A second figure stood a few feet away, watching the road nervously. Neither looked familiar. Nick crept closer until he could make out the tools: bolt cutters, a small satchel of metal stakes, and a folded sign. He caught enough of the words on the sign in the moonlight to understand its purpose. Community Access Trail, Directional Path. It was a pre-printed marker, professionally made, with a logo that matched one he'd seen on Karen's retreat materials. This wasn't a prank. These were contractors. Nick stepped out from the brush, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. "You're trespassing," he said, voice calm but cold. The man with the bolt cutters dropped them immediately, raising his hands. We were just installing a trail marker. We were told this was permitted." "By who?" Nick asked. The man hesitated. "A woman named Summers." She gave us the coordinates and told us this section was part of a public route. Nick lowered the flashlight slightly. She lied. This is private land. I suggest you pack up and leave before I call the sheriff. The second man didn't wait for more. He grabbed the folded sign, muttered something under his breath, and started walking. The first followed quickly. Nick stood there for a long time after they left, staring at the disturbed earth, the scattered tools, the quiet tree line that had, just moments ago, been breached. The next morning, he filed a criminal trespass report with the sheriff's office and attached the photos and descriptions. McLennan, the deputy from before, took it seriously this time. "This is coordinated," he said. "She's crossing the line from nuisance into criminal planning. We'll open an investigation." But Nick didn't stop there. He hired a private land assessor to conduct a full boundary survey and create a new digital model of the property, including 3D maps with security perimeters and blind spot analysis. He also contracted a legal firm that specialized in property disputes involving false public access claims, a niche field, but one that had grown in demand in recent years. Their senior counsel, a sharp woman named Ivy Calder, reviewed his case, his documentation, the photos, the witness statements, and the video from his motion cameras. "This isn't just trespassing," she told him. "She's attempting to create a false precedent of public access, what we call manufactured easement. It's a tactic used to wear down resistance and establish assumed rights. We can move on this. But you need to be ready to counter her next move." Nick was more than ready. Over the following week, Ivy's team sent cease and desist letters not just to Karen but to her service providers, collaborators, and any contractor who had worked on her events or installations. They requested written confirmation that these individuals would cease any activity that intersected with or referenced Nick's property. The pressure campaign Karen had started was now being returned with the full force of law. Her brand was suddenly exposed to risk. Her image, polished, curated, serene, now had a paper trail linking it to unauthorized use, misrepresentation, and active land conflict. And that's when the true consequence of her escalation became clear. She made a mistake. A single post, quickly deleted but screenshotted by someone in Ivy's office, appeared on one of Karen's secondary accounts. A photograph of Nick's fence line, tagged, "Soon to be open to all who seek peace." It was supposed to be metaphorical, poetic, perhaps, but in legal terms, it was damning. A clear and direct claim of ownership over land that wasn't hers. Ivy grinned when she saw it. "She just gave us everything we need." They filed for a restraining order. They moved to block her business license. They sent a formal request to the county board to revoke any standing permits and initiated a civil suit for damages. Karen had escalated this fight to wear Nick down. Instead, she handed him the rope, and Nick was finally pulling. The morning of the court hearing dawned dry and bright. The sky stretched pale and hard above Nick's land like taut canvas. The air carried the faint scent of dust and juniper, and everything was still, too still, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Nick dressed with the same deliberate precision he reserved for only the most serious matters. Clean denim, boots scrubbed of dirt, a crisp shirt buttoned to the collar, and the hat he usually only wore to funerals. He wasn't going to war, not in the literal sense, but the courtroom that day would serve as a battleground just as decisive. Harris met him outside the courthouse, binder in hand, face unreadable but calm. "She's going to try to charm the room," he said flatly without preamble. Her attorney filed a supplemental motion last night, claiming emotional distress, reputational harm, and an ongoing pattern of rural aggression. It's thin, but emotional tactics can skew a judge's mood. We stay clean. We stay focused. Nick didn't say much. He didn't need to. His entire body carried the years of wear and grit that only a life built on discipline could carve. The courthouse was modest, a 2-story building with faded walls and humming fluorescent lights, But today, it felt like a stage. Karen arrived 10 minutes before the proceedings, dressed in flowing neutral colors and accompanied by her lawyer, a man who looked less like a litigator and more like a lifestyle magazine editor. She offered Nick a smile as she passed, wide and stiff, the smile of someone who still believed in the power of performance. Nick didn't return it. Inside the courtroom, the judge took the bench with the tired precision of someone who had seen 100 cases just like this and didn't expect to see anything new. But this case wasn't typical. As Harris began to outline the sequence of events, his presentation was a slow, steady build, starting with the initial boundary violation, the ignored warning, the signage, the escalation of crossings, the unauthorized guests, the fabricated promotional claims, and finally, the use of the land in commercial advertising without permission. Each point was documented, each photograph time-stamped, each incident tied to a date, a witness, or a formal complaint filed with the county or state. By the time he presented the screenshots of Karen's deleted post, there was an unmistakable shift in the room. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Karen's attorney followed with a response that dripped with language about misunderstanding, miscommunication, and the supposed flexibility of rural land access norms. He spoke at length about healing spaces, about community engagement, about the importance of spiritual wellness in stressful times. He framed Karen as a victim of overreaction, as a woman targeted for simply trying to bring people together. It was polished. It was graceful. It was almost convincing. Until Karen took the stand. She began with a sigh, tilting her head and speaking in the lilting cadence of someone who had told the story many times to sympathetic ears. She spoke about her intentions, about how she never meant harm, about how she thought Nick was supportive. She described the flash incident with dramatic flourish, claiming it left her terrified, unsure whether she could feel safe near her home. But under cross-examination, the mask began to slip. Harris was careful, clinical. He asked if she had ever received explicit permission to use the land. She hedged. He presented the cease and desist letter. She called it harsh and sudden. He played a clip from one of her retreat videos, showing a group of people walking along a path with Nick's barn clearly in the background. She said it was an accident, that she thought it was common land. He presented the county recorder's documents showing otherwise. Her answers grew shorter. Her voice grew tighter. And then came the final question. Ms. Summers, is it true that you created a directional sign and instructed hired contractors to install it on Mr. Stewart's land without any permit or consent? There was a pause, long enough that the silence felt louder than the question. I may have misunderstood the boundaries, she said finally, eyes flicking toward the judge. No further questions, Harris said and stepped back. The judge called a brief recess, then returned with the ruling. His voice was measured, but the words were final. Karen had violated multiple property statutes. Her claims of misunderstanding were unsupported by any verifiable permission or evidence. Her commercial use of Nick's land, both implied and direct, was unlawful. The restraining order was granted. All operations associated with her wellness business were to cease immediately until further review and possible fines from the county board. Furthermore, Nick was awarded damages related to animal injury, property disruption, and legal costs. Karen stood frozen as the words landed, as if she couldn't quite process that the performance had failed, that the narrative she'd crafted so carefully had crumbled not in a dramatic twist, but under the slow, crushing weight of fact. Outside the courthouse, the air felt clearer. Harris packed his files with a quiet satisfaction, offering Nick a simple nod. That's what happens when someone underestimates the long game, he said. You played it right. But even with the ruling, Nick knew the matter wasn't over, not really. He returned to the ranch that evening and walked the boundary line, the late sun casting gold across the dirt and brush. It wasn't a celebration he felt, but something quieter, a return to equilibrium, to the understanding that every inch of this place had been earned and defended. Karen might retreat, might regroup, might even try something new in time. But the land was no longer a stage for her illusions. It was protected, documented, fenced not just by wire but by process and truth. And, perhaps most importantly, the story had been told. Not the story she tried to push, but the real one. The one written in hoof prints and tire tracks, in legal filings and eyewitness accounts, in every line Nick had drawn, not with anger, but with the kind of resolve that cannot be faked or shaken. Not in court, not in the dirt, not ever. The weeks following the ruling unfolded with the slow rhythm of things returning to their rightful place, like a disturbed pond finally calming after someone has tossed in a rock. Nick didn't celebrate, didn't gloat, didn't so much as speak Karen's name aloud. There was nothing triumphant in him, only the quiet, practical satisfaction that comes from defending what is yours with patience, precision, and unbending resolve. The court orders had been executed cleanly. Karen's signage was removed by county workers within 5 days. Her so-called wellness installations were dismantled. Benches, shade tents, laminated path markers, all torn down, boxed up, and carted off in a utility trailer that left a long trail of dust as it disappeared over the horizon. The community access page on her website was taken offline, and the social media channels that had once overflowed with curated images of people meditating near Nick's pastures were wiped clean of anything that even hinted at his land. For the first time in over 2 months, the boundaries of the ranch were once again boundaries in practice, not just in principle. Nick resumed his routines without comment. He mended fences, regraded the disturbed soil near the north pasture, and took the time to repair the stretch of fencing that had suffered most from the repeated crossings. He replanted the patches of native grass trampled by tire tracks, his hands working steadily as he scattered seed and pressed it gently into the dirt with the back of a rake. There was something meditative in it, not cleansing, not cathartic, but essential. The act of restoration without the need for attention. The land didn't care about courts or personalities, it only asked to be tended. Though Karen didn't show her face near the property again, her presence lingered like a faint echo, a residue that would take time to truly fade. Nick learned through town whispers that she had quietly suspended her retreat operations. She was facing fines for misrepresentation and a zoning review that would almost certainly shut her down for good. A few of her former collaborators, including Marina, had distanced themselves publicly, issuing soft statements about creative differences and regretful misunderstandings. No one admitted fault outright, but the silence said enough. The community hadn't rallied to Karen's defense as she might have hoped. Instead, there was a kind of collective shrug, an acknowledgement that lines had been crossed and that consequences, though delayed, had finally arrived. It wasn't justice in the dramatic sense. It wasn't public humiliation or some cinematic downfall. It was just a quiet collapse of pretense, the unraveling of a constructed image, thread by thread, until there was nothing left to cling to. And for Nick, that was more than enough. One late afternoon, as he stood on his porch sipping a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, a beat-up old pickup rolled down the gravel road and pulled to a stop near the gate. It wasn't anyone he recognized immediately. The driver, a wiry man in his 60s, stepped out slowly and walked up the drive, removing his hat respectfully as he approached. He introduced himself as Mitchell, one of the neighboring landowners a few miles out, someone Nick had only heard of through second-hand mentions. "I just wanted to say," Mitchell began, his voice low and even, "you did right by all of us. Most of us didn't want to get involved. Figured it would just blow over, or that she'd burn out on her own. But if you hadn't stood firm, she'd be tearing through the rest of our land by now. You put up a wall the rest of us needed but weren't willing to build." Nick didn't reply at first. He didn't need to. The words were enough. They shook hands, and Mitchell left just as quietly as he came, the sound of his truck fading into the rustling trees. In the weeks that followed, a few others came by in similar fashion. Not many, and not for long. A handshake, a quiet thank you, a brief acknowledgement that something larger had been pushed back, even if only for now. No one wanted fanfare. They just wanted to know that the ground under their boots still meant something, that private land was still private, that ownership still carried weight, that boundaries still stood for something more than symbolic lines on a surveyor's map. Nick never saw Karen again. Rumors drifted through that she had relocated to another state, maybe to try again somewhere else, someplace less rooted in old codes and quiet strength. Perhaps she would succeed there, or perhaps she would encounter another version of Nick and face the same outcome. He didn't speculate. He didn't care. Summer came on strong, pressing heat into the soil and stretching the shadows long across the ridges. The horses moved slowly during the day, conserving energy, and Nick adjusted their routines accordingly. He walked the fences less frequently now, not because he had grown complacent, but because he no longer needed to. The sensors remained in place, the cameras operational, but they had gone silent. The land had returned to its natural state, not untouched, but respected. Nick didn't erase the past months from his memory. He kept the records filed away, the court documents labeled, the photos stored. But he did not dwell on them. The lesson had been learned. The fight had been fought. And more importantly, it had been won not by force, but by steadfast refusal to give ground. On the last evening of July, as the sky turned molten gold and the cicadas began their long, droning chorus, Nick stood at the top of the northern ridge with his back to the wind and surveyed the property. The boundary lines, once crossed with impunity, now stood untouched. The paddock was peaceful. The grass was returning. The only tracks on the land were those he had made himself, and in that quiet, unremarkable moment without fanfare or witness, Nick exhaled. It wasn't the sigh of relief or exhaustion. It was something simpler, the breath of a man whose world had been breached, who had stood his ground, and who now stood alone, not in isolation, but in peace. The kind of peace that can't be taken, borrowed or borrowed again. The kind of peace that's earned.